Hello, hello. Welcome to the first session of reading through the Lord of the Rings together. Sorry, I'm adjusting my mic. Sorry if I'm a little bit late from the time I had originally set, but we are getting started now. And yeah, we're probably going to jump pretty quickly into this one. A few things off the bat is so this is a live close reading of The Lord of the Rings. This is going to be obviously the Fellowship of the Ring, and we are starting at chapter 1. The first paragraph, we're skipping the prologue. The prologue mostly is kind of more like the appendices. It's just information stuff that I don't think is necessary for us to go over at the start, more like something to go over at the end, if that makes any sense. Trying to think if there's anything else really. So yeah, this is the first two paragraphs of the first chapter. That's what we're going to go through. Try to get it done, we'll see. Probably shouldn't take us more than 30-45 minutes. If anybody wants to, comment, give ideas, or thoughts about what we read, please do. That is at some point supposed to become kind of a part of what these close readings are, is the thoughts of the listeners, influencing things and helping me see new ideas and contemplate things in different ways. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. A few other just quick shout outs to Corey Olson, who does the Exploring Lord of the Rings podcast series. That's essentially where this idea comes from. He has had his podcast for like 5 years now, and this is basically what they do. It's a close reading of Lord of the Rings, and they're like halfway through Fellowship of the Ring, a bit more than halfway right now. So I thought it was a good idea. I decided I was going to kind of do the same thing, first with the Bible, which that first session was this Monday, and now with Lord of the Rings. So let's go ahead and get started. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend. And it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure, and if that was not enough fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as 50. At 99, they began to call him well-preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess apparently perpetual youth, as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth. So let's just kind of start back at the beginning, and I'll just kind of read through the sentences and give just the general ideas. So, when Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, the first thing, it's interesting that it's Mr. Bilbo Baggins and that it's spelt out the whole way. Just, it's very British. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, was a British scholar and professor, so no real surprise there that he would write it out that way, but also the Shire is a very British culture, as we'll see as we keep reading. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. So I think you probably notice right off the bat, just because of how satisfying it is to say that Tolkien does not write the number 111, 11 plus 100 in any conventional sort of way. You know, us in America would normally say, yeah, 111, or perhaps like 11 and 100 or something along those lines. But we would never say 11st. I always wonder, I feel like I wish I had researched this beforehand, whether or not that was a common British construction or sort of a Tolkien thing, or a more, you know, somewhat archaic construction. I'm guessing that I would say it probably sounds less unnatural to a British person, but I do think it might have been something that he kind of did. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody else say it that way, really. It's clever. 11st, right? 11T, as in, you know, 90, and then 11D is, you know, 0 after 11. But the other thing you probably notice immediately, because that word jumps out so much, is 11st is 111, and that is very old. Right? It instantly is easy to tell, like, oh, this Mr. Bilbo Baggins is old, and not just old, he is very old. 111 years. For a normal person, that's practically unheard of. We'll see that for a hobbit, it's not quite as exceptional, but off the get-go, you're probably thinking to yourself, 11st, that's incredible. You know, how did he ever reach such an age? So I think it's clear towards the end that at 90 he was much the same as 50. At 99 they began to call him well preserved. The way it's said there, right, when we get to there, we'll talk a little more about it, but it's clear that, like, to them 90 isn't that old, right? Or you would expect to hear different comments about a human who looked, if like they were 50 at 99, you know, that'd be incredible, you know. People don't even live to 99 very often, especially not in a medieval setting. But that's the first thing that jumps out. And the other thing is that immediately you can tell that there's a very specific sort of cadence to Tolkien's writing, right? When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, right off the bat, the triple alliteration of the B's, when Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Right, the whole sentence rolls very well off the tongue, and I think it's the starting B's, then the 11st, and the fascinating word of Hobbiton at the end is very nice closure. So, something that a lot of people, if this is the first time they've heard of Lord of the Rings, something they might be wondering is, who is Mr. Bilbo Baggins? What is Hobbiton? Where is Bag End? What are all these things? Very odd names, right? A lot of this stuff, like, it's not really worth talking about because that stuff is all from The Hobbit, right? In The Hobbit, we get introduced to hobbits for the first time, or halflings, which are, if we had read The Hobbit, they are short creatures, right, of half-man height, essentially, who love food and farming and simplicity, essentially. That Hobbiton is one of their main cities, and Bilbo Baggins lives in Bag End, which I always found a little bit suspicious. It felt like there had to be a connection in the names there somewhere. And Bilbo Baggins was the hero of The Hobbit, the previous story. And so anybody who has read The Hobbit instantly knows exactly who we're talking about. Actually, I do know that there's a sort of joke in the name Bag End that is essentially like cul-de-sac. Essentially, if you translate it, literally means bag end, end of bag. So I do know that that's sort of the joke there, I think, is that Bag End is like just a well-to-do sort of person living in his cul-de-sac, if you know what I mean. His Bag End is kind of the joke there. Going on, Bilbo was very rich and peculiar, and this is that sentence is a lot of fun for both Hobbit readers, and it's a really good sentence for people who haven't read The Hobbit, right? Though we start to get a nice description of Bilbo. For us Hobbit readers, though, it's a fun one because at the beginning of The Hobbit, we read that Bilbo is particularly not rich and particularly not peculiar. He is, well, that's not true. He is still quite rich, but he's not extremely rich, and he is most definitely not peculiar when you start off The Hobbit. He's about as generic as hobbits go, and it's funny now in hindsight, like the way these chapters parallel. I wish I had added the heading for the chapters, because the name of this one is The Long Expected Party. The first chapter in The Hobbit is The Unexpected Party. So Tolkien's having his fun. There's a lot of jokes in these first couple chapters before things start to get rather dark. Bilbo was very rich and peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The disappearance being his leaving of the Shire to go on a quest with 13 dwarves to the Lonely Mountain to slay the dragon and take back the kingdom. That all happened. That's in The Hobbit. And then Bilbo's unexpected return. He comes back many years later. Well, actually, no, it's only about 1 year later. And everyone is shocked that he is still alive. Everybody thought he was dead. They were auctioning off his house as he walks back through the door. And so, no wonder all the people in the Shire, when a man disappears, turns back up a year later, out of the middle of nowhere, buys back his house in the middle of an auction, no less. You can imagine the tales that start to, the rumors spread pretty quickly about something like that. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure. And that's the sort of legend that I was hinting at in the just a minute ago, right? The people know that he went on a treasure hunt, essentially, right? And they know he brought back some riches. And so now, these years later, right, he went when he was about 50. All these years later, right, the next generation of hobbits he's a local legend, essentially, right? That under Bag End, there's tunnels stuffed with gold. And as we'll see, there's more reason why they might think that. We'll learn more about these legends. But it's especially funny that whatever the old folk might say is just a sentence that I love. And if that was not enough fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. And this is an interesting sentence, because it's probably the first time that you start to that something interesting really seems to happen, right? Up until now, Mr. Baggins is just, okay, it's Bilbo. If you've read The Hobbit, you know what the story is. Okay, he's living really old, he's having a 1st birthday, everybody finds him a little peculiar, but now this is interesting. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as 50. At 99, they began to call him well preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. And even as a first-time reader, I think it's a little odd, right? If you were paying a lot of attention in The Hobbit, you would notice that Bilbo is related to the old Took. The old Took who lived very, very old, the oldest Hobbit in memory. And so you might say, oh, it's just, Bilbo, he lives a comfortable life and he has long living bloodline, no wonder he reached such a ripe age, and whatever, he has good health. But if you haven't been paying a lot of attention, it's even more obvious that seems a little bit odd. And even with the argument about the old Took, it still is sort of peculiar that he would be living so long And the comment about unchanged is what particularly tips us off as the reader. Up until then, we might have just been thinking, oh, whatever, maybe hobbits just live that long. But at 99, they began to call him well-preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. Right, it starts to... Tolkien starts to tip the hat a little bit that, like, even to the hobbits, this is odd. And they don't even acknowledge how odd it really is. Like, Bilbo pretty much looks the exact same as he did 40, almost 50 years ago. And people marvel at it. And that's even, the simple people of the Shire. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess apparently perpetual youth, as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth. This sentence is, it's a funny sentence because it seems very simple on the surface, just, the people of the village doing, the rumors and the, small talk and gossip or whatever that you might expect, but if you pay attention, there's something really interesting here. This is essentially the first bit of foreshadowing in the whole story, because they are right. It was too much of a good thing. It was, as we will see, Bilbo's perpetual youth and inexhaustible wealth did come back to bite him. And I think it's funny how even this early on, Tolkien, he does a really good job of very subtly hinting that everything isn't totally normal about this situation, and that there might be something slightly insidious going on, or at least that Bilbo might have something coming for him, essentially, if that makes any sense. I'm not sure if that's really the right phrase, but the image of them shaking their heads and thinking it seemed unfair that he would have apparently perpetual youth as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth it's very amusing, the whole setup there. It's the fact that they're mad essentially about something that they kind of made up themselves. Like, he doesn't actually have inexhaustible wealth, they just think he does, is really funny. So, does anybody in the chat have any other real thoughts about this section of the passage? I'm not sure if we really have anybody on right now. Yeah, it's partly my fault. I was planning to go live earlier in the evening, but I did not make it till just now, or 25 minutes ago. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next section of the text. It reads... Oh, sorry. There was one final sentence. The next paragraph. It will have to be paid for, they said. It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it. I apparently misplaced my slides. This one doesn't fit. But this sentence is so... Everything that I said about the last one is so much truer in this sentence, right? It will have to be paid for, they said. It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it. It's so interesting that in hindsight, how true this sentence is. If only they knew, right? It will have to be paid for. It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it. All three of those are incredibly true. Like, so true that, like, even they surely weren't thinking to the extent or about the sort of things that actually came to pass. You know, it isn't natural. I'm sure they weren't realizing how unnatural it really was. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. The other funny thing, you already get this picture that Bilbo is a really interesting character in the Shire, you know, in the People's Reckoning, right? That his party is of special magnificence, excuse me. There was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton, and you already start to get this picture of, okay, why was there so much talk and excitement about somebody's birthday? I mean, sure, a party with special magnificence, yeah, it's his 11st birthday, but why is that so exciting to everyone? And the first, you know, you get tipped a few different ways. The first is Bilbo was very rich, and you go, okay, well, that partly explains it at least, you know. It's going to be a nice birthday party. But following up on that, and peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years. You keep reading, and it becomes clearer and clearer that Bilbo is a sort of... He's a pretty interesting character to them, right? He's this weird old guy who disappeared and then came back. And apparently his tunnels are full of money. And apparently he just doesn't age. And apparently a lot of people think that's kind of unfair. And, you know, there's always these rumors and talk about, like, oh, old Mr. Bilbo, he's so lucky. How did he get the money and the long life, right? And so you already get this interesting picture that a lot of people, like, are kind of grumpy about Bilbo, but they're also interested by Bilbo, but they're also, like, sort of wary of Bilbo, right? And it's this funny little... He's already a very interesting character. I hadn't planned on going this far, but I think I'm gonna go ahead and read the next two paragraphs. I'm afraid I won't have the slide up. But so far trouble had not come, and as Mr. Baggins was generous with his money, most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and his good fortune. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, except, of course, the Sackville Bagginses, and he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits and poor and unimportant families. But he had no close friends, until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. So we'll stop there. We might read the last paragraph of that section. But so far, trouble had not come. And that sentence is a direct follow-up to the, it isn't natural and trouble will come of it. But so far, trouble hadn't come. Okay? And as Mr. Baggins was generous with his money, and now you get tipped, there it is, another reason why people might really appreciate going to his 11st birthday of special magnificence. Bilbo is very free with his money. Most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and his good fortune. And it's just positively funny, you know, it's amusing, this way that Bilbo works, that the people are wary of him, you know, as I said, and they don't totally like him, but he's really generous, and he's a friendly guy. So, you know what, he's good after all, you know. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, and then in the parentheses, except of course the Sackville Bagginses, is a nod to us Hobbit readers that the Sackville Bagginses, he did not have very good friendly terms with them ever, really. They apparently tried to steal his spoons and were upset when he was found alive because they had wanted his house, essentially. So the Sackville Bagginses were never very friendly to Bilbo, and neither him to them. And he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits of poor and unimportant families. And I think that sentence kind of speaks volumes. I think it's the first sentence where you start to see the like who Bilbo is as a person, really, right? Not just the perception of other people of him. Up until then, even the sentence was generous with his money. That's not exactly, you know, it's a good quality, but I wouldn't say that it's like it's not a statement. It isn't a, it's not exactly like the most, I'm trying to figure out how to say this, but, you know, saying he was generous with his money, I mean, to a degree, that's also sort of like a, you know, he was a little bit too free with his money, but it also is like a, you could be generous with your money without really doing much good, if you see what I mean. That's not necessarily a super good thing, you know, like if you're just giving money to like your own friends, you know, or something like that, like it's hard for me to explain exactly what I mean, but I think this later mention that the people he's giving money to, presumably, or the people that he's hanging out with and trying to spend time with and helping out are the poor and unimportant families. I think that speaks a lot more volumes, that those are the people that he's spending his time with, that that is the first. That's another oddity of Bilbo, that it seems that other people hadn't noticed as much, but to us, that one might actually tell us the most about who he really is, right? And that sentence or clause right after is probably the second sentence that really tells us who Bilbo really is. But he had no close friends. And that is, it's one of those sentences that it's hard to really know what to make of, right? It sort of just happens, and it's too objective and vague for us to really know what it means. You know, is Bilbo, does he enjoy being alone? You know, is he just kind of introverted like that? Or is this something that, like, you know, because he's so rich and peculiar, he has trouble making relationships with people? It's one of those sentences that it's hard to really make from it now, but I think looking back, it's always one that really kind of jumps out to you, that Bilbo, you know, that Bilbo was struggling to get along with a lot of other people, that after his adventures and all the things that happened to him, that he found the rest of Hobbit culture a little bit drab and found that it was hard to connect with other people. I think is kind of telling. I think it's one of those first instances of Tolkien we will see very much imbued the text with a lot of the feelings for a lot of the characters go through what you would expect of like a soldier coming back from war, right? Probably a lot of things that he felt and many other soldiers felt coming back from World War I. And this sentence here is probably the first instance of that. It's very light and it's very easy to miss, but he had no close friends, and I think that's interesting until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. And I think that's also interesting. We'll learn more about these younger cousins, but it's funny. These younger cousins, we'll find out, like, most of them are also kind of somewhat peculiar in similar ways to Mr. Bilbo, right? They really look up to Bilbo, and it's like he can't find friendships amongst his fellow hobbits, and, you know, he has to find other hobbits who will enjoy listening to his stories and talking about the same things as him, and the only people who those end up being is, you know, the people that he grew up telling stories to, you know, the people that, of course, they're interested in the same things he's interested in. He's their uncle, you know. So, reading that last paragraph, the eldest of these, and Bilbo's favorite, was young Frodo Baggins. I think that and Bilbo's favorite. Some people might, say that, oh, it's favoritism. Whatever. It's, for one thing, they're his nephews. It's not like they're his kids, so it's not exactly unhealthy. And for another thing, I don't think any of the other nephews, as we see, are really jealous of Frodo in that way. When Bilbo was 99, he adopted Frodo as his heir and brought him to live at Bag End, and the hopes of the Sackville Bagginses were finally dashed. Bilbo and Frodo happened to have the same birthday, September 22nd. "You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." At that time, Frodo was still in his tweens, as the Hobbit called the irresponsible 20s between childhood and coming of age at 33. So a few interesting things stick out. I wonder if you notice them. The last sentence kind of tells us a lot more about the way hobbits work and their ages work. Right? So that illuminates very much so on why Bilbo is 11st, and that's not exactly incredible, because the tweens for hobbits is between their 20s and coming of age at 33. That's a lot later than we come of age, and you would think that means that there's no way they're actually, there's no circumstance in which humans would ever just push our coming of age all the way back to 33, right? That's just really far into our life, especially in a medieval period when people, they might die at the age of 50 or 60, So you can tell that it's probably not just a cultural thing, it's probably also a literal physical difference in the way that they age, right? That they don't hit adulthood really until the age of 33. The other interesting thing, Bilbo was 99 when he adopted Frodo as heir. I don't think I ever noticed this before, but that's the same age when people started calling him well preserved. I don't think there's anything there, but I just noticed that, and that's kind of interesting. And brought him to live at Bag End, and the hopes of the Sackville Bagginses were finally dashed, because they would never get Bilbo's house now that he had an heir, right? Somebody else who would take it. And that last section is just charming. Bilbo and Frodo happen to have the same birthday, September 22nd. "You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." It's funny, that's actually, you may have noticed, that is the first dialogue in... Well, actually, no. That was a lie. This is the second dialogue. The first is the very, the very indirect and, sort of, it's not in the passive tense, but that's the vibe you get. "It will have to be paid for," they said. "It isn't natural and trouble will come of it." Well, that's, who said, when said, where did they say this? What? Not very specific there. And this second one really isn't either. We're obviously getting very broad narratorial strokes here to start the book off, which is interesting because most of the text isn't really like that. "You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." I love the simple matter of factness that Bilbo says it, "Oh, you had better come and live with me." just one day he was like, "Oh, maybe you should come live with me, wouldn't that be great if you were my heir?" Just casually, I think that tells us a lot about Bilbo as well, that that's just kind of the way Bilbo is, he just is like that. He's one of those kind of characters. You could say, yeah, it might be like a somewhat a British sort of thing, right? I could totally see a British person saying something like that. But it's funny that Bilbo he just kind of drops this on him like, oh, you know, you should come live with me. That would be fun. And then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together. Like, that's his reasoning, because he was like, oh, it's so much of a drag to have to go to your house to celebrate our birthday. We should just do it together at my house. You know what? You should just live with me, you know? I'm sure it's clear that there was probably a lot more behind it, right? That he, obviously, Frodo was his favorite, you know, and I'm sure he really cared for him. But it's funny that Bilbo just kind of, he sort of puts that pretense up. Like, that's the reasoning that he gives, you know, he sets it up that way. So that's probably all we'll read in this one. If anybody has any thoughts, go ahead and put them in the text or in the chat. This is one that, as I said, I meant to start earlier. I obviously only had time to make one slide. I'll try to get on that, you know, make it a little bit smoother next time. But thank you to everybody who watched. If you're checking out at a later time, I hope you enjoyed the video. That is the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs of the first chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring. It's a little bit, you could say, a light section. There isn't too much to talk about or too much going on, but it's still quite fun, and I think as we keep going, we'll find that there's a lot of interesting moments. Once we get to chapter 2 especially, things will really start picking up, and we'll have a lot to talk about. So until then, thank you for being here.